Hey all, so today's video we're going to be looking at something a bit different. So this is a personal observation from myself, and it's something that was something I've not experienced before, and just thought that might be an interesting topic for a video. So I've recently got back from a trip to South America, in which I spent my time in Chile and Bolivia. I spent most of that time in northern Chile, in the Atacama Desert in San Pedro de Atacama, and then briefly up into the southwestern part of Bolivia. Absolutely fantastic trip, saw amazing things, beautiful scenery. But what was a bit different about it was that most of the trip I spent at altitude. Now, San Pedro de Atacama, which is in the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert in the world, apart from one little part of Antarctica and the Ross Dependency. San Pedro de Atacama is generally at an altitude of around 2,400 meters. By contrast, Auckland, where we're based, our clinic is based, is at an altitude of 0 meters. We're at sea level in Auckland. I've not spent much time, well, any time really, at any significant altitude, so it was quite a different experience for me. Going into Bolivia, that altitude increased quite a lot, to the point, I think our maximum altitude that we got to in Bolivia was about 5,000 meters, maybe a little higher. I just wanted to have a brief chat about my experiences with it, how the altitude affected me, and how I've found it's been affecting me since I've got back, as well as just a really brief discussion on what we do in terms of using altitude to potentially enhance athletic performance. So firstly, I was pretty lucky in that I didn't at any point during my trip get any altitude sickness. So altitude sickness is something that anyone really can get especially if they're experiencing altitude for the first time. You don't start to notice the effects of altitude until around 1,500 meters or so. And then it's not hugely noticeable for most people until about 2,000 meters. 2,400 meters is considered to be the point at which most people will start to properly notice the effects of altitude. And I definitely found that with my time in San Pedro de Atacama. Like I said, I didn't get altitude sickness, but what you do notice is that if you're doing any sort of physical exercise or physical activity, you've got to work quite a lot harder for your air, basically. So what's happening is the concentrations of the atmospheric gases, of what the atmosphere is made up of, don't change with altitude. So we've still got that 20.9% oxygen that we have at sea level. The difference is that the air pressure reduces, so the air is basically just more spread out. So it's a little bit hard to, in any given breath, you're getting a little bit less sort of total volume of oxygen, I suppose, in. That means that your body's getting less to use, you're getting less oxygen brought through to your muscles. So, for instance, we went on a pretty fantastic bike ride from San Pedro de Atacama out to Valle de la Luna, which is, if anyone has a chance to go there, I'd highly recommend it. It's fantastic. It's a 14k bike ride, it's not huge, but at altitude for the first time, it ended up being pretty challenging. There's definitely some pretty big hills there, and I was definitely noticing the differences with that. Moving into Bolivia a little bit later on, I'd kind of adjusted a little bit to the altitude at San Pedro de Atacama. I'd been there about a week, but it was a jump of, probably an average jump of another 2,000 meters going into Bolivia and into the salt flats. And again, that was the same sort of thing, except higher altitude was a little bit more pronounced. I wouldn't say symptoms, but things that I've noticed. So even things like getting up a little bit too quickly, you'd get a little bit of a head rush. Walking up hills, we climbed, not mountains, but a few decent-ish hills. It's definitely a lot more effort required than it would have been to do the same thing at sea level here in Auckland. What was really interesting and what's really prompted me to do this video, though, is how I felt when I got back. Now, altitude training is something that is pretty commonly used in high-level sports. There's a few different ways of going about it. So a lot of the times we'll set up altitude tents, which is a contained tent or contained room where the pressure of the gases in there is reduced. Either the oxygen concentration is reduced to mimic the effects of altitude, or we do reduce the pressure in the space to again mimic the effects of altitude. Or people who are particularly committed to it will often live at higher altitude. So live at, generally we say, around 2,000 meters is probably a sweet spot. A little bit higher would be better, so about 2,400 meters would be ideal, but there's not that many places where you can kind of both comfortably live there. And then the next part, which is why that becomes difficult, is the best way for someone to train that way is to live at high altitude and train at lower altitudes. Now, what happens with altitude is that there's a few different adaptive changes that your body does to try and allow you to work optimally at those altitudes. Now, one of the better known things that it does is you get an increase in your red blood cell count. So your red blood cells are if people think of a blood cell, they generally think of a red blood cell as kind of circular, donutty looking red things. Their job is to carry oxygen around your body. The more of those you have, the higher your blood's capacity for oxygen. So if you're in a bit of an oxygen-starved environment for a prolonged period of time, and I say prolonged, I did notice some adaptive changes with being there for about a week and a half. But even within that short space of time, we're going to get more of those red blood cells created. The body becomes a little bit more efficient about how it uses its oxygen. So your muscles are able to produce the same amount of force or work for the same length of time with a little bit less oxygen used. And so a few other different metabolic changes and things like that. So basically the whole idea is to make as much use as possible of the available oxygen. Now, those changes don't last forever, obviously, when we come back down to sea level. That you don't need that higher red blood cell count, say if you're training at sea level, so your body will revert and go back to its kind of norm. It's generally better that way. There's a reason that we have the red blood cell counts and things that we have at this level. It's because it works best here. Higher red blood cell counts can have issues. But you do maintain those changes for a little bit, and if you're, again, one of those athletes who's willing to live at high altitude and then train at lower altitudes, the adaptive changes that you get at the high altitude, they kind of allow you to work normally, almost. But if you bring that down to lower altitude, where there's a lot more oxygen available, those changes allow you to work a little bit better than usual. So, especially with cardiovascular things, you're going to notice that you fatigue a lot less quickly, that you recover a lot more quickly, and that you don't tend to, muscles and things just don't tend to, as well as that sort of cardiovascular fatigue, muscular fatigue doesn't seem to be as big an issue. Like, you kind of go harder for longer almost. So what I was noticing, again, with just my, say, week and a half or so at altitude, was as soon as I got back, fatiguing a lot less quickly with cardiovascular exercise, and recovering a huge amount more quickly. Now, I've been back for about 2 weeks now, and I'm starting to notice that this is reverting. It's going back to how I normally am, which is fine. But it was a really, really interesting thing, because while I've been away, I've been hiking a lot and doing things, staying active, but I'd not been specifically training while I was away. So I was expecting to kind of come back and kind of struggle with some of our CrossFit workouts and things like that, especially as we're going into a bit more of a cardio heavy cycle. And I found it the complete opposite. It's quite interesting. So there we are, guys. Just a little bit of a tidbit on altitude, some of its effects on the body, and how that might be useful for altitude training and athletic performance. We'll be back to our more regular upload schedule pretty soon. Look forward to those. All right, cheers.